Well, a market system does not just appear from a cloud. There are certain preconditions that are necessary for capitalism or the price system to operate in a society. What is necessary? First thing that has to be there are clearly defined property rights. Now, what's a property right? If you remember all the way back to John Locke and the framers, that we hold that people have natural right to property. Property right is a decision right. That is, whoever holds the property right in something gets to decide how that something is used, right? So a property right is really, at bottom, a decision right. So in a market economy, because we believe in individual property rights, individuals get to decide how to allocate their own resources. They make those decisions. And all the things we see around us in a capitalist society are the product of somebody, some private person having made a decision to use their own capital, we'll talk about this, to produce the good and service in the interest of making a profit. Right? These things just didn't appear from the sky. So you have to have clearly defined property rights, and you also have to have a rule of law that tells people in pursuing their goals, there's certain things they're not allowed to do. They're not allowed to use force, theft, or intimidation, right? You're not allowed to steal somebody else's property. You have to bargain with them. You're not allowed to force somebody at gunpoint to hand over their wallet. We've seen this rule of law. So it prohibits fraud, force, and theft. You're not allowed to misrepresent a product you're selling. If you say something is 14-karat gold, you are legally responsible for being certain that it is 14-karat gold and not some fake gold-plated something or another, right? So the rule of law requires, it must be in place where government prohibits force, fraud, and theft. So government also has to define property rights, has to prohibit force, fraud, and theft, and government also has to enforce contracts. If you sign a contract in a market economy, you must be held legally responsible for fulfilling that contract or the whole system will break down. So this is government's chief role in a market economy. As we saw, it's the same thing as we saw in Chapter 1, Freedom, Law, and Rights, when we talked about what is the chief role of government. It is to administer the law, and that's exactly what the conclusion that market economics comes down to. The role of government is to administer the rule of law. Again, prohibiting force, fraud, and theft, clearly defining property rights, and enforcing contracts. So these are preconditions of a market economy. You can't have a capitalism if you don't have a basic rule of law, clearly defined property rights, prohibition of force, fraud, and theft, and so on. It's impossible. So that's the first precondition. But given that, if those conditions are there, individuals have private property rights, they are entitled then to make a decision about how their property is to be allocated. Some people may choose to spend it, other people may choose to invest it in the production of other goods and services that they hope to bring to the market to sell to other people. I mean, that's very simplified, and we'll come back and elaborate upon that basic framework. But that's how it works in general. But it's the most important point is that private individuals, whether singly or united together in a group, an organization, you can merge with other people with a common interest and pool your resources. But the individuals and the voluntary associations get to decide how their own resources are used. And so they're the ones who make the decisions about what to produce. Nobody tells them what to produce. They are allowed to make a decision. Do I want to produce another pair of, a new kind of cell phone, or a new shampoo, or whatever? People make those individual decisions for themselves. That's how it works. Private people make those decisions. Now, who decides who gets the fruits of production in a market economy? Who decides who gets what? Well, again, individuals who have property rights get to decide who gets what. And how do they decide that? By their decision of whether to buy something or not. The fruits of production are distributed by the voluntary free choice of individuals who choose to buy something. If you choose to pay the price that the seller is asking, then you will get a property right in that good or service. And people who choose not to buy it don't get it. So it's a voluntary system where individuals themselves, the consumers, decide ultimately who gets what by their willingness to pay or not to pay the price that the seller is asking for a particular good or service. So in both cases, production and distribution Under capitalism, private individuals, you and me, decide what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets it. That's the first and central point. Now let's compare that with how things operate under a system of a planned economy, whether socialist, communist, or whatever. You know, people often ask, what's the difference between the two? And generally the answer is that socialism is sort of communism light. There's not a whole lot of difference in kind, but it's the question of degree. As we'll see, in a pure communist society, government controls 100% of all resources. In socialized or socialistic societies, there's a different degree or percentage of the areas of society that government controls. We'll get back to that when we talk more about the planned economy. But for the purpose of understanding the economic arrangements, they're very similar, if not identical. They have different means. Communism also confiscates all the wealth, whereas socialism might allow nominal private property, but nevertheless, government controls the direction of resources. We'll come back to this. But for right now, the question we want to ask here is, in a socialized economy, a planned economy, who makes these economic decisions? Who decides what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets it? We saw in a market system, it's private individuals, you and me. We decide. It's quite different in a socialized or planned economy. Who makes those just production decisions? Who decides what to produce, how to produce it? And who decides, even if indirectly, how it is distributed, who gets it? Well, I'm sure you already know the answer. The answer to that is political authority of some kind or another. Government, in short. Some agents of government decide what to produce, how to produce it. And of course, they indirectly then decide who gets what. What comes, let me ask you this, what comes first, production or distribution? Production or consumption? Which comes first, production or consumption? I'm hoping that most of you immediately grasp that production necessarily must come first. You can't consume something that hasn't been produced. So ultimately, whoever makes the production decisions will decide, however indirectly, what it is that people can consume. You can't consume something that hasn't been produced. So production decisions are all important, all right? So in a planned economy, government, centralized authority of some kind or another decides what to produce and how to produce it. We saw that under a market system, private individuals make those decisions. In other words, decision making is radically decentralized, right? There's not one central authority that makes a decision for everybody. There's just you and me and hundreds of thousands, millions of people making these decisions. In a planned economy, there's centralized planning. Some central body of people, a small, very small group from within the larger society as a whole, makes these production decisions. And they decide what to produce, how to produce it, and then they have significant input into how it is distributed among the populace. That's the main difference between the two systems. Who decides what to produce and how to produce it, and who decides who gets it? Private individuals or government, political authority of one kind or another. So the economic problem, if you think about it, let me restate what that was. We said the economic problem is, how do we allocate the scarce resources of this world in such a way as to produce at the lowest possible cost and to use those resources to produce things that individuals actually need or want. If you think about it, the economic problem, therefore, is at bottom a knowledge problem. You see, if there was someone who knew the best use of resources, who knew the lowest cost means of production, and if they knew exactly what people needed or wanted, we would just hand over all power to that person and all resources and say, go for it, do it, make your plan. If you have that knowledge, if you know what to produce and how to produce it and who needs what, then implement those decisions, right? And utilize that knowledge to produce the perfect economic plan. The problem, however, is what? What's the problem there? How do we know what the best use of resources is? How do we know the lowest cost method of production? And how do we know what people actually need or want? And not only for ourselves, which is hard enough to figure out, which we don't even know that most of the time, but for in any kind of large or developed society where there are millions and millions and millions of people, there's 330 million plus in America, can anybody possibly know what all these people need or want throughout over the course of time? As we shall see, the answer straightforwardly is no. Well, how about the central planners? Do they have greater access to knowledge? In a socialized system, do they know what to produce, the lowest cost ways of production, and do they know what people actually need or want? They know even less than in a market economy, right? There are a handful of people who are supposed to plan for the needs and wants of millions upon millions upon millions of people. Well, as you can see, under either system, the question is, how do we get the knowledge that we need? Because we need that. We have to, if we're going to have any kind of rational economic system, we need to know what to produce, how to produce it, the least cost method, and we need to know what people actually need or want. And that's why I say the economic problem at bottom is a knowledge problem. And so the question how to solve the economic problem is this: how do we get the necessary knowledge that we need in order to have a rational economic system that produces things at the lowest cost and produces the things that people actually need or want? How do we get that knowledge? We must have it. What knowledge do we need? We need to know exactly what resources are available to put into production, right? What are the inputs? What's out there? And we need to know the lowest cost way of production. And we need to know what people actually need or want in their own subjective judgment. That's the problem. And we shall see that the reason historically, as a matter of historical fact, this is nobody's opinion, this is go look at the experience of the human race, that those societies that have managed their economic arrangements in a capitalist manner invariably outperform materially their counterparts in planned economies. There's no question about the relative efficiency and efficacy and prosperity that is wrought by capitalism as opposed to central planning of any kind. The whole 20th century is nothing but an object lesson in this very experiment in collectivized economies. And inevitably, those economies collapsed, not only collapsed, but produced immense misery for the populace. Not to say the destruction of spiritual values such as freedom. But there has none of the 20th century was nothing but a big experiment in collectivized economics. We saw the Soviet Union, the pure communism. We saw socialism. We'll talk about that. We saw, of course, we see the planned economies of fascism, the various kinds of socialistic experiments conducted all over the world, and still so. In all cases, those economies failed to deliver or to achieve the goals set by the people who set up those arrangements. Societies that have adopted market practices, however, have uniformly flourished in a material sense, right? People are wealthier, they have a greater, higher standard of living, and all of those good things. Now, that's not to say that that is conclusive, but because we still have to address the moral dimension of the two systems, capitalism and socialism. But from a strictly material standpoint, there's no question that capitalist economic arrangements uniformly outperform any sort of planned system. Those planned systems that seem to work are usually parasitic on various market practices. We'll get back to that. And the reason for that is, it's not because necessarily these are all bad people. You know, they might be very, very good people. The problem is in a planned system, the planners have no way of acquiring the knowledge that they would need in order to make rational economic plans. They don't know what to produce, they don't know how to produce it, and they don't know what people need or want. Capitalism, on the other hand, the reason why it's been so successful is not because people are better or smarter or anything like that. It's because capitalism allows those who are responsible for decision making to actually get the information they need to make rational economic plans, to use resources wisely, that is, efficiently, and in the production of things that people actually need or want. And that's what we're going to be exploring throughout the rest of our discussion of freedom and economic society. How is it? How is capitalism able to allow for the generation and utilization of the knowledge that is necessary for a rational and prosperous economic system, and why are planned societies inevitably doomed to fail in that regard? And the answer is, again, the knowledge that is generated and utilized in either system. So we're going to take a little break, and then we'll come back in our next segment to discuss this amazing phenomenon that we call the price system and how it helps human beings solve the economic problem that each person and each society inevitably faces. Okay, till then, bye.